Hello and welcome to Costume Dramas We Love, a panel all about the influence of costume and period dramas on our lives, our work, and so many more things. This panel is part of CoSy2021, aka the Costube Symposium this year. Thursday, August 19th through Sunday, August 22nd is when those things are going to be running live on YouTube, but most of them should theoretically still be up later if you miss it. So check those out. This is a free online event for all costumers by Costube. So you can check out all those videos, announcements, other activities right now on at Costube Symposium on Instagram and on Facebook. So if you want more of this kind of cool stuff, check that out. I will also link you in the description. I am your moderator, Bianca, aka Book Hoarding. And now let's meet the panelists. I'm going to start off with Ayana. Tell us all about yourself and your interests.
Well, I'm Ayana, also known as the Vintage Guidebook on all social media. I am a social and fashion history enthusiast. I have a blog, I have an Instagram, and just other social media where I kind of share my journey recreating certain items of clothing or delving into a certain era. And I spend a lot of time on Twitter live tweeting period dramas I'm watching.
I have loved watching Mr. Guidebook experience Jane Austen things on Twitter. It's been great. Amanda, take it away. Tell us about yourself.
All right. Hi, my name is Amanda-Rae. I am a cosplayer who turned into a freelance journalist, reviewing the period dramas we watch often. So you might have seen my reviews on places like Den of Geek and GBH Drama Club, or just Twitter, because I do a lot of just Twitter screaming about UK TV and period dramas in general. So that's kind of where I come from. Like, I liked recreating the costumes, and I decided, what if I analyze the screenplay itself? And then that's, on Twitter, I'm at Amanda-Rae Prescott. On Instagram, which is half dead because I only use it to look for set photos, it's at Amanda-Rae Poldark. And I actually, quote unquote, got permission to use that name because I just didn't want my last name out there on Instagram. So that's how that story goes. That's me.
Love it. Natanya, can you please take it away?
Sure. Hey, I'm Natanya Barron. I'm a fantasy author, but I also write a lot of historical fiction and historical fantasy. But I've been into fashion and fashion histories for as long as I can remember. I started kind of sharing my fashion research valve on Twitter as Thread Talks, and that kind of became its own living thing, and doing my nerdy research into the history of fashion across cultures and across time. And so that just kind of became its own little adventure and something that I will continue to do in the fall. But I absolutely love costume history and very much an enthusiast, not a sewer or a creator. So I am constantly in awe of people that can do that. I live in fear of sewing machines. But other than that, I appreciate the work that is done for sure.
Yes, those threads are amazing. I love them. I love seeing them pop up. I always learn something new, and I'm always in the camp of, now, how can I make this thing? Now I need to learn a new thing, because that's my brain. And Joanna, last but not least.
Hi, I'm Joanna of Blue Lady Couture. I'm a dressmaker. I specialise in historically inspired fashions, a bit of period costuming, and I also do steampunk and cosplay. I've always been fascinated by costuming in movies and TV, with it strongly influencing much of my work, whether creating for myself or for clients. I particularly like Regency, kind of through Victorian to World War One, but I do other eras, and I love a bit of pure fantasy as well. You can find me on YouTube as Blue Lady Couture. I'm on Instagram as at Joe Blue Lady Couture, and I also have an Etsy shop as well.
Now, I wanted to start off with giving my kind of definition that we can work off of, and then you can all add or subtract from it. But costume dramas and period dramas are kind of used interchangeably. The way I kind of view it is period dramas are the more focused. This is in a set historic period, and we're at least aiming for that historic period that there's actual record of. And then costume dramas are the kind of umbrella for the bigger productions that are using, maybe inspired by history or adjacent to history, doing their own thing with that, but also just in general using high cost, high drama costuming to tell a story in some way in whatever fantasy or real period they're trying to tell it in. Sound good? All right. What impact have costume dramas had on you?
Well, for me, kind of as I said in my introduction, I've been kind of obsessed with costume dramas ever since I was a very small child. I wouldn't be here doing what I'm doing today without them. I wouldn't, my client base wouldn't be coming to me because they love the costume dramas as well.
If I go back and try to trace which period drama impacted me the most, it's probably a struggle because I was watching PBS Masterpiece since I was a little kid. But I think the one that really stuck in my mind, I can still visualize those costumes to this day, is the Forsyte Saga reboot in 2003-4 with Damian Lewis and Gina McKee, like that. I mean, Irene and Soames, they're very high Victoria costumes of like, but I still, even though the plot is in hindsight very problematic, just those ball costumes and the high-end Victorian costumes I'm like, one day I'm like, maybe I'll recreate one of those. But I'm like, yeah. But I moved on to in terms of my interests. The 2013 movie Belle with Gugu Mbatha-Raw, I was like, this is the first time I actually saw like a Black character in costume wasn't a slave, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's like my dream to like recreate at least one of her ball gowns. So from there, I'm noticing that in more of the recent period dramas, like seeing people look at me, like really kind of change the way I think about my costuming, versus like it from a maybe I can dress like this to okay, I totally belong here sort of thing. So that sort of, I also realized that like my true obsession is the long 18th century, Interregency, and not as much a fan of the bustle era. For me to be like a nightmare to sew as well. Although I respect everybody who can sew the era, but like, yeah, that kind of shifted my perception of costuming a lot.
I think for me, what's so fascinating, I've been watching costume drama since I was a little kid, with my family. So for me, I can't remember a time where I didn't think, oh, wow, wouldn't it be cool if people still dress like that today, or alternate reality, if we all wore clothing like that. And it was only recently that I kind of thought, oh, you can. Like, I did not know that costuming was a thing. I didn't know about cons. I didn't like any of that. I did not connect the two. I can sew, but it never occurred to me, okay, I could sew period clothing. Until really recently. So for me, it's been something where it made me ask more questions about the time period that I saw the clothes in. Because when you start asking questions about the clothing, you start learning about the time. So why do we need these skirts that are that long? Why do we need cravats? Why, you know what I mean? So it helps you learn a lot about the period. And even in sort of fantasy settings and things like that, I think a really good one with good costumes, will set it up so it still answers those same questions in universe for whatever is canon, in that world. It'll still kind of do the same questions, which I think is really cool for fantasy and sci-fi settings and things like that, because it doesn't exist, yet you've created a whole backstory here that just has to do with the clothing the characters are wearing. So for me, it just makes me like ask questions and keep going down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, I think a lot of that resonates with me. I mean, for me, I'm often coming to it as a writer. So storytelling has a big part of it for me, because what a character is feeling and how they're experiencing the world has so much to do with what they're wearing and what access they have to clothing and the kinds of clothes that they can afford and the kinds of clothes that they can wear or are allowed to wear. So I talk a lot about sumptuary laws and things like that, because that has governed people for so long. And we talk about, disparity and privilege, and all these things are so folded in. That's my first pun of the day. Folded into clothing history. I think for me, my mom is not a reader, but she's an avid classics film watcher. So she had me watch as a kid, I don't even remember the first time I saw like the big classics, like Gone with the Wind and Dr. Zhivago, and super problematic films like we're talking about, and there are a ton of problematic things about fashion, just period, and colonialism, and we can talk about that, I'm sure. But the beauty of that nonetheless was so appealing to me, and you could learn so much about a character by what they were wearing or how they were wearing. And Gone with the Wind is used all the time, but there's a character story about clothing in that film. Someone who falls from grace and has to try to make an impression by making clothing out of the drapes, right? That's like, it's very ham-fisted storytelling now. You're kind of like, that's awful. But nowadays we look back at it and go, I mean, they were trying to make a point, and people now are so much more even divested from clothing as work and clothing as culture that we just buy a t-shirt, right? No one thinks about that. So yeah, I think I've always been fascinated by that, and then the evolution of it, like how clothing changes over time. And when I was in the 3rd grade, I did a report, and it was clothing from the 1910s to the 1940s. And I just did a panel and kind of looked at how the things evolved and why they evolved, and sort of looking at new fashion and releasing from corsets and changing into the sort of the freedom movement. And not many 3rd graders are in that kind of stuff. So I think we're all probably built from a similar DNA. Exactly. Yeah. We see these things though, and we ask a lot of questions because it is so dramatic. And we're all, I mean, I'm probably one of the older people here, but I was born in the 80s, and that was already when fast fashion was everywhere. So we already had lost that. And I felt like we were missing something. And as a kid, I was like, man, my mom made her own clothes, but I never got to make my own clothes. And I missed that. And so I've always been looking for hints of yesteryear, I guess.
I think what's interesting in that interplay, right, is that like, as we're talking about these two, these are made in the periods they're made in. So there are perceptions of the periods, the year they're made in, of those periods, which the prime example is always the Olivier Pride and Prejudice, the black and white one, where they're just like, we are redacting all your ideas about Regency, and we're going to put them in the 1830s because we think it looks dramatic, and that's what they wanted on screen. And I think that's like an interesting context in that, and all the layers of it, right? Because they're just layers of the actual history versus Hollywood history. And I think that's also an interesting lens to look at it within. Because as much as people are like, oh, the costumes, like, I mean, they owned it. They made their characters and their costumes as dramatic as the dramatic characters they made, because that was very much of the time to be over the top. So I would love to know, what are your first costume drama, period drama? Like, what was the first one? Like that one that you're like, I remember this as like the one that like, we kind of already got into it, but like maybe that like pushed you farther. That was the one that like you always kind of go back to as like a key part of like this timeline for you.
I think Emma, what was it, 1994, 1996, the one with Gwyneth Paltrow, that one, I think that's the earliest one I can remember watching like as a tween or teen. So it was, my choice rather than watching it with someone else. And I just remember thinking like, wow, this is really beautiful. And I really liked that movie in particular, I think, especially at the time, because I was old enough to see differences in clothing. So I noticed a lot of people who will watch, at least at the time, I think it's definitely changed a little bit now. But a lot of people would watch period dramas, costume dramas, because they would like the ballroom scenes, and people would say things like, oh, I want to dress like that for my birthday or for my prom or, graduation, stuff like that. These very formal events, right? But I think that was the first movie that I thought, wow, there's a lot of utilitarian everyday clothing here, and I wonder what it would be like if you wore it in real life. And I think that's what kind of put me on the path of thinking about clothing as sort of an extra character in all of these films. And then I think after that was probably Lord of the Rings. And I think that was just the end of it for me. I was like, okay, so you can have this clothing that works in regular settings. I need to find a Renaissance fair. I need to find like somewhere to wear this in real life to see like, is this possible? So I don't know. That's so hard to pin down like one specific one. I don't think I have a particular one, but I think I would say maybe a particular time. So anything that kind of came out in the late 90s, early 2000s, I started just like gravitating towards it, just like eating it all up. Anything that was set in a time period before my own, I was like, yes, let's do it.
Well, I already mentioned the Forsyte Saga. I should probably explain the plot for people who haven't heard about that one. basically it's a story of a marriage falling apart due to like abuse and money and emotional issues. That's kind of in the late Victorian, early Edwardian era. It's kind of the summary of it. But another one that stuck out for me, since Ayana mentioned Lord of the Rings, for me, getting into Doctor Who also helped me circle back into period drama, because some of their outfits are set in period, others are like period inspired mashups. And the great thing about Doctor Who costumes is that many of them you can find on the rack. If you know your UK fashion, you can go find things at ASOS and Topshop and All Saints and all that fun stuff. But of course, you got to make the period costumes, because those are a lot of those are probably recycled from other BBC productions, but sometimes it makes the original ones. But yeah, Doctor Who, like seeing the utilitarian and practical, and also seeing the like kind of outlandish, can only wear this at a con or fair. And then, of course, that Doctor Who was the reason why I attended cons and fairs in the first place, because that's where all my friends, they were like, hey, you should stop talking what's online and go meet other people. And that was, for me, it was also mid-2000s because I just went to college and started watching Doctor Who. And then things just went more and more into being obsessed with period drama after that. Because people forget that Doctor Who is partially a period drama. And no matter how much they try to advertise, it's not. It is.
Mm-hmm. And I would also say, like, there are some Star Trek holodeck episodes that are very in that realm, like Fairhaven. Like, there are some things that you're just like really in there exploring period in a way that I think is as right there with Doctor Who. It's in its own way a costume drama, because it's taking from that genre to interweave into their own plots.
Yeah, I think for me, definitely growing up in the Henson era, movies like Labyrinth and The Dark Crystal, even though it's half puppetry, half costuming, it's such a set piece, and you're so engrossed in it that you're kind of also realizing that these are, I mean, it's art, it's living art, right? Like the puppet of Agra in Dark Crystal is just so incredible, and it is costume and it is art and it's this living character. And of course, David Bowie dressed up as Jareth is just like a cultural and also probably adolescent touchstone for many people, because it was just also gender bending and just this larger than life character that seemed to come out of nowhere in a period where I think, American culture and British culture were kind of asking a lot of questions that were important to ask. And it was a children's movie, right? Like our parents rented this for us and everyone was like, what is in his trousers? Like, but these were also kind of Regency trousers and kind of pulling from a whole bunch of different eras, and really fascinating. But I think for me, what sealed the deal was the BBC Pride and Prejudice series. I mean, Colin Firth in Regency clothing was the long jacket, the bathtub scene, all of it was just probably too much for my brain to be. I had never even heard of Pride and Prejudice until my roommate showed me the series on VHS in college. And it was just love at first sight. And I loved how each of the characters had their own fashion and their own design, and every sister had her own take and curled her hair differently and had different embroidery and different days. I'm always looking, especially in Regency film, you see this a lot, like if dresses are reused, right? If different scenes and characters are wearing them more than once, it says a lot about a character. Can they afford to wear different dresses all the time, or are they wearing the same dress over and over again? The fabrics that they're made out of, how they change or how they adapt them to different sort of ensembles. And, I love to see treatments of that. And I think Pride and Prejudice is a fascinating way to look at that, because some directors have just said, well, if we look at it, the period, it's too boring, right? Like the early Regency is kind of paper bag shaped, and but if we go a little later or a little before, maybe it's a little sexier. So it's interesting to see how different things, but it's also freedom of movement, which I think is really interesting. Almost every adaptation has Lizzie running at some point, which you certainly don't see in later Victorian, because he's not. And you don't see in a lot of other period costumes if you're wearing a sack dress with, really tight stays and tons of fabric, because it's just not, reality. So there's just so much interesting stuff there. And I had not ever seen those shaped dresses before. I was not familiar with any of that. And it just sort of shifted, I think, a lot for me in my brain.
I think that also is like a hallmark changing how Regency as a whole was costumed and thought about, because as much for flack as like some get, especially 2005, for making the Bennets look like, they have a pig randomly in the house, all this stuff. I'm like, but they were clearly trying to hearken to this started idea that was already in the pipeline for Austen things, to be like, we need to make it clear that class distinction in a way that modern audiences would immediately get in 2 seconds. And they do that through costuming so well. And also now the Darcy, like the romantic Darcy in some way in your film in a billowy shirt and that's it, is now part of the canon. And I love that like that's there because of that movie and because of Colin Firth. And then you're just like, okay, we're running with it. It's here forever now.
Yeah. And fashion doesn't change overnight. I think that's what I loved about the 2005 film is that you can see the older fashions and the characters who can't afford to wear the current costumes, which I think was just so brilliant.
I've seen that now since that, I feel like in Sanditon and like other things of the era where they're just like blatantly being like, and I mean, Bridgerton to a degree, if you will, of using that as a visual signal to people. Like these are the young folks running around these silhouettes, and you'll notice the older generation, the ones that are not running around on the market, are going to be in this other costume. That pulls them down more.
Again, pinpointing down to just, a handful is so hard because, again, growing up in that era, the late 80s and through the 90s, so many influences, coming at me from all sides, from, the British TV scene through to films. Like Netanya, Labyrinth is a big one that I remember from very early on. That iconic ballroom scene, it's just that kind of high impact dress design. It's just, it's kind of mind blowing to a young girl. You kind of think, wow, this is incredible. And again, Sarah was the character of Sarah in Labyrinth is someone I probably identified with quite a lot as I grew up as well, having this interest in costuming and this love for history and, wanting to dress up and being a little bit different, not necessarily fitting the mold of, your stereotypical kind of sort of teenage girl. So that's one film that did very much speak to me. Again, growing up for the 80s and 90s, I was there for the Disney Renaissance, as it obviously is known in the Disney circles. And I know a lot of people can, take or leave Disney, but for me, they're iconic images, that have been with us for almost the past 100 years, and I think that says a lot about the design and the costume design that went into the characters that they created for those films. So yes, again, that was a huge influence on me growing up. Very much where I kind of learned to draw and kind of hone some of my artistic talent was purely by, drawing and kind of copying the Disney princesses and the princess dresses. That's kind of how I started my design journey. So that's really important to me. Then again, like Netanya, the 95 Pride and Prejudice is probably one of the first kind of costume series that I could really vividly remember. And I remember watching it through the first time when it was on TV. And I can vaguely remember, I was only 10 years old when it came out. And so I can vaguely remember the kind of the hype just in the UK with it. It was kind of, for some reason, it was considered kind of groundbreaking at the time. It just captured the kind of the national kind of, the kind of people were just obsessed with it. And then obviously the whole iconic Darcy scene, and so to this day, it's still influencing costume dramas and the way we portray men in costume dramas. So that was, so I remember seeing that when it came out, and then I revisited again because it's one of those dramas. It stuck with me for a long, long time. And for a long, long time, I was very, very interested and passionate about Regency costume. I wasn't really interested in the big dresses and things, of the later periods. I kind of love this strange simplicity and this kind of, it's the Regency era. So I've revisited again when I was in my teen years, and I used to rent it almost every week on VHS from the local library. And I think I was the only person in the entire region that rented this out. I used to sit up on a Saturday night. I used to spend my Saturday night sat up till nearly 1 a.m. watching the entire series through. And then later on, I had the VHS for myself that was bought for me. and I actually wore the tape out because I used to watch it so much. And then I eventually had it on DVD, so I can watch it as much as I like now. Although, to be honest, I haven't watched it as much recently as I should go back and rewatch it. And then I think the final one that was probably had the highest impact on me sort of growing up was the film Titanic, which came out in 1997. To this day, that is still the only film I have ever seen at the cinema more than once. Yeah, it was the only way. I mean, at the time when it came out, it would be months and months and months before it would come out on DVD or VHS. So the only way I could kind of get a fresh fix on seeing all those amazing costumes was to go to the cinema again. So I was just obsessed with Titanic from the age of 12. I was obsessed with Leonardo DiCaprio. I was obsessed with the costumes, and I was just sort of became obsessed with that era as well. So yeah, that it's kind of just a small summary of just a handful of the films and programs that have influenced me.
I mean, Titanic is definitely like one of those like iconic, that was its own dramatic moment for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
I remember too, like you're all talking about like these Regis things in the 90s, and I remember there was a brief fad of empire waisted dresses for women.
Oh, there sure was. There was,
and
yeah.
Yeah, and like a little bit of like flowy toppage too. Growing up, I was always like, was this connected? Like this looks like modern styles, and like that was just like always a thing that was just like, is this just one of those weird synergy things? And then Edwardian also a little bit can sometimes have that empire waisted because they're all classical inspired, right? Mm-hmm. It's always going back to, we want to look Grecian, or our ideas of what Grecian is. So it's really interesting to see again the cyclicalness too of this. But then when you dig through those layers, modern fashion being inspired by the period dramas we bring in and how we select those period dramas. Fascinating. Alas, the flowy white shirt for men did not catch on. I feel like that's a massive letdown.
It's like a Seinfeld joke, right? That's about it.
Yeah. Like how dare they do that to us when we could have had men running around in these whatever. I'll live.
Can I just say that my husband, we went to the Jane Austen Festival over 10 years ago now, and he very obligingly grew sideburns for me, and he has since kept them.
We respect. I have so much respect.
My husband's gonna love me for saying that, but yeah, I just had to be done. Yeah, but coming back to the your point actually about Titanic and sort of modern fashion, it really inspired me actually to do history bounding before I even knew what it was. I spent a lot of my 12th kind of year history bounding as Rose from Titanic in whatever I could cobble together from, modern fashion stores, as a 12-year-old can with her pocket money. I had this long I was kind of trying to emulate her flying dress, the pretty blue suit that she wears. And I had a long floor ankle length kind of navy blue with blue flowers on it, kind of long skirt, it's all in the fashion in the 90s. And then I used to wear a blue t-shirt and a navy blue long sleeve blouse, kind of half buttoned up with a belt around it. And that was my emulation of
I respect
1910s fashion. And yeah, that was me history bounding before I even realized.
Yeah, I had lots of, I did the poet shirts with the vests. So it was like the shortcut to like kind of look like I was doing something, because I was totally a nerd and I was super into Lord of the Rings, like before the movies even came out. Like I was just like, I didn't even know in my head what it might look like, but this worked. This was like short change for nerd, right? Like if people saw me, they would get it. They would get it. Like regular people don't wear poet shirts and vests. So
I mean, like that's just their loss. Like, let's be real, because that's a great combo. They look great. I see so many because like now like cottage core and like hobbit core and goblin core. I'm like,
I know.
Listen,
oh, man.
Y'all were just missing out clearly on some of us ahead of the curve.
Mushroom earrings. My daughter's 9 and she's just like, she wants mushroom earrings and like toadstool earrings. And I'm like, I was born in the wrong time. Like, so cute.
I mean, as long as someone's enjoying it and going to keep it alive for, in perpetuity. Okay, a slight lightning round. What are the costume dramas you love? The ones that you watch again and again? Yeah, Pride and Prejudice is for sure going to be on there. But like, what are the ones that like, those are your cozy watches that you're going to turn on when you were just needing to feel good or needing something in the background?
Downton Abbey, for sure. I don't know. I have kind of a love-hate relationship with the plot, especially as it moves forward. Just the history nerd that I am. I'm like, guys, you guys, so much license. But costuming wise, it was perfect every single season. I think they did such a wonderful job. Like when I want to be inspired, even though that's not my preferred like fashion period, it's just, they move so seamlessly through, you know, Edwardian, we're getting the 20s, then we're getting sort of the late 20s. And I think you, even if you don't know a lot about historical fashion, you can kind of see subtle differences. You can see characters changing. You can see, like we talked about, some characters who don't change, and what does that mean for them? And I think it's just so comforting to see it done well. Not even in terms of accuracy, but just in terms of consistency. You know what I mean? Each character is consistent with what they wear and why and when. Everyone is consistent with the changes in time and who would have, you know, jumped on new fashions, who would have done things that are just wacky, like not even things to wear, but just for the shock value of it all. I mean, I think there's spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen Downton Abbey yet. The one scene where Lady Sybil wears pants, and she didn't wear them out to, you know, be around other people. She did it purely just to kind of say, look what kind of person I am. Look at this. I'm going to wear this. And, you know, you're all going to be so shocked. Look at Lady Mary, who cuts her hair, you know, just for the shock value there. It's so perfect. I think the costuming there is just perfect. I put it on anytime. Like, I just want to feel inspired and see an era that has so much detail, really.
And like, I also think that like Downton Abbey does a lot for that period and tradition, that transition, that other period dramas, because they either are focused or that's a, you know, back, you know, that's not the focus. I think that was a really interesting tool, because that, for me, that helped click that costume transition, or not costume, silhouette transitions from Edwardian, like from Titanic to Gatsby. Like that was a thing basically that was like, oh, that's how that happened. That's the transition.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, Downton Abbey is another one for me that is one of my go-to, and I'm rewatching it through again at the moment. Well, if I have a big job of hand sewing to do, I will put that on in the background, and it's just comforting and just nice, and you can just dip in and out of it, and it's so lovely. But yeah, for me, I find it, for a long, long time, for me, costume history kind of stopped in 1914. You know, I had no interest in World War One and, you know, guns and cars and war, and that just didn't appeal to me in any way, shape, or form. You know, I was very much, you know, earlier in the sort of the 19th century kind of, that was kind of my jam. But then as I've got older and obviously learned more about the world and kind of developed my interests in history, I actually, my husband and I actually joined a World War One reenactment group, and suddenly it opened up this whole world of how things changed and why things changed through that 1910s period, when I just think that is so fascinating. And for me, that era is kind of, it's where we get the modern woman, you know. She's suddenly throwing off all these like stuffy dresses and petticoats, and, you know, and transitioning through into kind of the 1920s. And it's something that we see actually quite nicely with the character of Edith, and how she, again, spoilers, she becomes a career woman. You know, and that's just such a modern kind of concept. And even with like Sybil, when she does her nursing during World War One, I do have some slight issues with her costume, her nursing costume. It's a little bit, not quite sure where she is with it, but again, obviously they were portraying her as a character that was going through this change. She wanted to be, you know, she didn't want to be the woman that's, you know, the young lady that stayed at home. She wanted to go out and make a difference in the world. And obviously nursing was one of the ways women of her class could do that. So yeah, so I really love Downton Abbey for how they show that progression. And again, in a way, bringing kind of the 1920s to life as well, because again, for me, 1920s is one of those eras that's a little bit not sure about this, it's a bit shapeless, and but actually seeing the characters wear it, and go about like their daily lives, wearing those styles, it's it just it re-glamorized it for me, and it kind of reignited, or well, not reignited, ignited a passion for the sort of the more vintage styles, which I now kind of use more in my everyday looks. When I want to look a bit vintagey, but also not go full on costume. The 20s and 30s has so much potential for the modern wardrobe.
For rewatching, Downton's a huge one for me as well, because that was also my first like big fandom, because before then I was just watching things by myself, but Downton Abbey had a whole live tweeting thing. Like I was always on PBS's hashtag every Sunday night talking about it. I also refined my ability to watch UK TV before you see it in America, because you want to discuss it with people without spoilers. And then of course the massive season 3 finale spoiler that kind of like went all over the internet. Like I saw it live, like I saw it live from the UK, and I'm like, oh gosh, America's gonna melt down as soon as PBS airs this, like 2 months later. But of course it was already out online. So it's like learning fandoms. I think that was like my first, I think Downton Abbey was transitional in that sense too, because that was the first big period drama fandom where people had social media to talk about it in real time. I'd say before then, the Austen remakes in like the mid 2000s and some of the movies, people would talk about it, but it wasn't on LiveJournal and some of the older social media sites. But you had Facebook, you had Twitter to talk about things in those groups and blogs, and it'd be a lot of fashion blogs and a lot of like people doing a lot of Downton inspired crafting, and a lot of the vintage the vintage people at that time are very heavy into like 20s recreation. Because there's that was I think the first big one. Not to say that Austen and other things weren't there, but that was the first one where like it also captured the mainstream in a way that others did not before, because everybody was talking about it, not just TV critics, not just like nerds and folks. So that was a big one for me. But in terms of 20s and 30s that were not Downton Abbey, one of my favorite comfort rewatches is actually a period comedy. Well, 2 of them actually together, because they're kind of from the same universe. Jeans and Wooster from the late 80s, early 90s of Hugh Laurie and Stephen Fry. And then related to that, Blendings, which is another adaptation of the P.G. Wodehouse books and short stories that starred who did it star? A bunch of British comedy folks, and like they made it in like 2012 to 2014. Because they kind of changed. Of course, that always happens. They film a season and they have to change the cast after halfway through. So it starred Jennifer Saunders. First season had oh god, I forgot his name. Father Brown, who was in the first season. But the person that caught me in there was Jack Farthing, aka George Like Poldark, because Poldark's my other binge fix. Because not so much the 70s version, but the 2015 reboot with Turner, like that I got obsessed in terms of costuming, in terms of recreating costumes. Because from there, I saw Demelza, I saw Oliver Thompson, I'm like, okay, I want to dress up like her. Like, I want her costume. So I literally learned to sew on YouTube from watching that. So those 2 are my Woodhouse obsession and Poldark. I think what I love about Poldark in particular, because it's the story of different classes and class warfare plot, and what happens after the Revolutionary War for England. That's a huge part of the plot, because it starts out with this guy who has to come back from the war. He has no money. The place is a hot mess. His girlfriend married his cousin, and it's a whole disaster from there. But what I love about it is that it captures the late 1780s into 1790s, like what people were wearing before the Regency and then after, because the 1790s is a period that not a lot of people film in. A lot of Austen stuff starts later, and then you have things like Hamilton and Revolutionary War stuff, or Maria Antoinette, where it's like earlier era. So it captures that transition from before Regency to after very, very well, even if people want to fight about like costume accuracy. But to me, I think in terms of the decisions make sense for the characters. And blendings, and Jeeves and Worcester for me are just like, they're funny as heck. Cute 1920s into 30s costuming. I mean, the main characters there are men acting a fool, which is always fun. But then some of the women, there are like, the outfits of the women are just like cute and flowy, a little bit less formal than Downton Abbey. Because they are still wealthy, but they're a little bit more casual, because there's not a lot of like ball seats, mostly just like dinner on a Tuesday night kind of thing. So those are my comfort views I go back to a lot.
I think for me, my education is in a medieval period, so I'm a medievalist by education. So I love medieval and early modern stuff, and for me, it's always going to be the Tudors. I always come back to Tudor costuming. That's probably where, actually, the only thing I've ever sewn was a set of Tudor stays that I actually made out of reeds. I found like wood to make them out of, I don't know. I have ADHD. Sometimes I do things and then I'm like, never again. I did that once. I learned how to do it. I'm good. But back before we had like, much in the way of videos, I found like actual patterns online, and I had to like measure them out on a paper bag. But I love the silhouette of the period. I love the fabrics. I'm a huge damask nerd. So just anytime I see that kind of contrast in fabric, and the Elizabeth film that came out when I was in, I think, my freshman year of college, I remember seeing it in the theater and just being blown away. And I didn't even know how good it was, because I didn't know that they were actually recreating from paintings, and that, we have such incredible records of Elizabeth's wardrobe, and like down to every button and pin. And, we know that stuff, and they were actually using that to inform their clothing, which makes it harder when, I know someone mentioned rain in their list of things. We could probably talk about that later. It makes it harder when it's not done as well, because it like, there is a bit of a reaction. But to me, just the use of fabric and sort of that beautiful of light, and especially her cloth of gold gown, which is amazing. And it's actually used from the same cloth that her sister was coronated in. So it was like reused, but it was such an expensive amount of fabric that of course they can't just, it was folded away and put and kept safe to use again. Which you see happen all the time, which people are like, what, how would you, the fabric was made 40 years before the dress was made. It was like, yeah, because fabric was really, 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 really expensive. And I think on top of that, actually, which is another Regency film that is not often thought of, but Bright Star, which is the Jane Campion film, really uses fabric, and really this beautiful female gaze kind of approach to filmmaking. And Fanny's embroidery is such a part of her character, and the texture on everything is so up close and personal, and the sort of sensuality of clothing and the sounds that clothing makes, and the sort of poets, obviously the poeticism of Keats and his short life, and the blood on the cloth and all of these things. The symbolism is just so incredible. And I love that movie. I cry like an absolute ridiculous baby. Keats is my favorite poet, and I can't ever get through the film without like turning it off and like lying on the floor for a little while and then coming back to it. But it's such a beautiful film, and it gets fabric culture. It gets the importance of that, and making that about characters and women, especially in that time, as something that would have been so intimate for them in their daily lives, especially a middle-class woman. That's what she would have been doing almost all day long, whether she wanted to or not. So those are probably my two most comfort films.
Bright Star is so good, and so just like heartbreaking. When I first watched it, is like little Bianca. I literally was like, I need to break up with my boyfriend. This isn't real love.
This isn't real love.
It's not real. It's not real if it's not this level. And that's what movies teach you. That's maybe a cautionary tale for introducing teenagers to romantics, because that's going to take you into a very intense realm of what love.
Just learn about Percy Shelley, and then you're like, oh no, this was fine. This was fine.
Byron, yeah, he's great. What do you?
Yeah, sure. No toxicity there, just fine.
No, it's great. It's fine. Get them reading Bronte real young, everybody. I would love to talk about, we've already kind of touched on like specific pieces, but if you'd like to delve in more to either ones you already talked about, or maybe from the films we've talked about, a costume itself, one that like, you're just like, that was one that really struck me, but also, was it something that maybe pushed you to do more research, push you to like include it in any work you were doing, or even try to recreate it? I know we talked a little bit about you know, from Titanic, iconic, beautiful flowing dresses, a little bit about Elizabeth in the cloth of gold. Are there any others too that you're just like, this is one that really, like, that costume is like, I cut it out, it's a thing that I am obsessed with?
I'll jump in if you want, and talk about Game of Thrones a little bit. So stepping away a little bit from sort of historical sort of costuming and into kind of the pure realms of fantasy. And obviously it's very much based in a kind of pseudo-historical, medieval-ish kind of, you know, that kind of genre. But yeah, the costumes in Game of Thrones are something else. And obviously it's quite recent. Well, she says recent, thinking how many years the series went on for, but you know, in the grand scheme of things, it's a very recent series. And yeah, the level of detail they went to in that, and I think that is something that sets it apart as a fantasy kind of epic and puts it up there with the likes of Lord of the Rings and those kind of high fantasy epics. It's the level of detail which you don't always get in, dare I say it, more budget perhaps fantasy productions. And unfortunately, I think that reflects on the costumes and gives them that kind of cheaper, I'm trying not to be mean, but I think you can probably understand what I mean, that kind of that classic Hollywood trope of what fantasy costumes should look like. Whereas I think Game of Thrones really took it to the next level and made it something that's believable, just through the sheer level of detail. I became obsessed with the costumes just from the get-go. And it actually inspired me to make one of my first cosplays for myself. I actually recreated Marjorie's wedding dress from series 3. And yeah, I never want to see another fabric rose again as long as I live. Hand sewing however many hundred of them there were. But yeah, being able to study the garment and, you know, recreate, you know, work out how it was made and look at the fabrics and how they utilize the fabrics. And on some of the other sort of dresses throughout the series, the level of detail in the embroidery that they used and how they created that world with the subtle differences between the different kind of countries, the different families, and how they interwove the symbolism, kind of that medieval kind of heraldic symbolism, but giving that more fantastical kind of twist on it. It was just, you know, it was incredible. And I was very lucky. I actually got to see the tour when it came to London a few years ago, and they had Marjorie's wedding dress was one of the ones that was there on display. And yeah, just being able to see those costumes kind of up close, and they weren't behind glass, there was just kind of like a low level kind of wire, so you could literally, I was leaning over as far as I could, you know, to get around the back of it was, yeah, it's, yeah, the Game of Thrones costumes are just up there as, you know, they're so iconic. And yes, Game of Thrones has a lot of, if you haven't seen it, it is very dark, it's very adult, it certainly has some scenes that a lot of people will find uncomfortable in it, but you know, the costuming in it is just incredible. So if you are comfortable watching kind of these darker kind of stories, yeah, just for the costumes alone, you have to see it.
I appreciate anybody who will elevate a costume budget to like their battle budget, their fight sequence budgets, because it shows. It 100% shows, you're right. And I also appreciate going to costume exhibits, because I have definitely been the one being like, I'm going to lean over this wire to get a photo, use my phone to get the backside of this dress because everyone wants to know how it closes. Shameless. We got it. We do it for each other, right? We help each other be better.
Yeah. Well, I also had the privilege of going to the Hollywood exhibition when it came to the V&A Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, again a few years ago. And, you know, I was so hyped for it, all these amazing, iconic Hollywood costumes that were coming, one of which was Kate Winslet's boarding suit from Titanic. And I was so excited to see it and, you know, and be able to photograph it. And yeah, you couldn't photograph it. they banned photos. And yeah, then they were hot on, if you had your camera out or, your phone out, they were on you and were like, no, you can't do that. So I bought the book for that accompanied the exhibition, thinking, well, that'll be great. It'll have, all these wonderful sort of pictures of it. And it's probably one of the worst accompanying books to an exhibition that I've ever bought in my life, I have to say. It has just very little of like the costumes that were on display in it. It kind of talks a lot about kind of the overall kind of story of Hollywood costuming. And it was just such a shame when you couldn't take photos in the exhibition. But yeah, I just wanted to add that in. It's one of my interesting stories.
Let people take photos. Or supply us with the photos, because we gotta know. We need to know every stitch in that thing.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it was a time, perhaps like, I can't remember the exact date it was, but we're probably going back 15 or so years ago now. It perhaps wasn't when the costuming and kind of the cosplay kind of community is perhaps as well recognized as it is now. I think it's a much bigger thing, certainly in probably the last 5 or so years compared to sort of when I was sort of earlier on in my costuming kind of journey.
I want to bring it up a little bit, because like anything I feel like past past World War I think goes into like vintage territory rather than historical. I mean, it's still historical, but like the, association. I have 3 shows that just, speak to me in that sense. Probably Mad Men, The Crown, and Call the Midwife. And I feel like those 3 shows could not be more different. But, and I'll go through them really quickly. So Mad Men is about an advertising agency in New York in the 1960s, hijinks ensue. The Crown is about the British monarchy, starting with Queen Elizabeth II in the late mid-50s, somewhere in there.
With some jumps, with some back and forth.
With some jumps, yes. But it kind of starts there. And then Call the Midwife is about British midwives, again, starting in the 50s and kind of goes on through a few decades. I think it's so similar to Downton Abbey, how all 3 of these shows deal with transitions. And I think all 3 of them handle it beautifully. I think all 3 start, in their whatever year that they introduce themselves. And then they very seamlessly go through time so that you feel like you're going through all of these years or decades in some cases with those characters. And you see those really subtle differences in fashion. You see the haircuts change. You see the hemlines go up or down. I think it's just so, outstanding the way that it really does change the tone for a lot of moments in the shows. And I think there are a few outfits that stand out to me. And I don't know what this says, but all 3 of these series have a scene where a female character is in a gorgeous dress and having the worst time of her life. I'm thinking, if anyone knows, of Betty Draper in her sad clown dress with the polka dots, worst night ever. I'm thinking of Princess Margaret in that floofy blue number when she has to stand in for her sister and everyone tells her, no, we're never letting you speak again in public. And in Call the Midwife, when Jenny breaks up with, or were they going out in the first place? See, but there's a sad scene between her and a male character, and she's wearing this beautiful dress. Also, any scene with Nurse Trixie, just style goals. But I think there's something really interesting, especially when we're talking about the 50s and 60s, because they're so, they're seen, especially in mainstream, as these hyper feminine eras. And it was not a great time for most women. So I think there's definitely that irony there. And I think all three of those shows kind of subtly give you that. You know, I think really the more beautiful the dress, the worse of a time a character is going to have is sort of their rule. But I love it. I love all of the clothes that all the characters wear in any scene in all three of those. I think was just done so well. It shows their mood. It shows the tone of that season of a series. All of these have way too many seasons, by the way. All these shows have so many. And it's crazy because you can just pop right into a different season and it feels like a totally different show, and not in a bad way, but just very different based on the clothes, based on, in some cases, they're totally different characters. Some of these shows didn't keep the same cast, but it's done really well. It's not done in a way where, you know, you're looking around and you're like, who are these people? It seems very flawless. I'm thinking especially of Call the Midwife, who I think by the last few seasons, I think there's only like a couple characters from the original one. But that's amazing. That's amazing. I think the tone is still the same. I think, I mean, as far as style inspiration too, I think having, they all did such a great job of having their female characters in skirts and dresses so much of the time that when you see a character wearing pants or pedal pushers or something like that, it stands out. You know what I mean? And I love that because it kind of shows you that in the past, yeah, pants were not, I mean, pants existed, but they were not something you would really wear no matter how avant-garde you kind of thought you were. And I think that goes into what someone said earlier about a lot of shows and movies that tend to be a little bit more budget conscious or maybe trying to appeal, have that modern appeal. We'll throw something really modern in there and have a character, a female character who wears pants, and it's like, see, she's edgy. And it's like, no, that would not have happened. I don't care how edgy she is, no. Except for, you know, a few rare occasions, she's not wearing pants. And I think those three shows do such a great job of showing you female characters who do wear pants, when they wear them, and why that's such a big deal. I think, you know, in our current time, it's such an easy thing to miss and not give it a second thought. You know, we can wear whatever we want now and it's great, but I don't know why I'm going on about the pants, but it's such a subtle thing for me. I love it. And when you think about a character like Betty Draper, she does not wear pants except when she's horse riding. I think you maybe once or twice in the whole entire show, even when she's cleaning the house and no one is home. And I'm like, Betty, girl, it's okay. Like, no one's here. You can wear pants. You can, it's fine. And it just says so much about her character that even when she's home alone, she will not do it. She will not break, character almost, you know, that mask that she has to the world. And, you know, for me, I think some of those dresses in all three of those are so iconic that I have to recreate them. Like, it's on my to-do list somehow. But I think that all three, it's tough to do a series, I think, that goes through time. I think that's really tough. And I don't know, I admire all three of those so much. The Crown is still, I think as of this recording, I think it's still, there's more seasons, right?
Yeah, I think there's at least one more.
I'm terrible at keeping up with that.
There's a lot.
At least
there's a ton.
There's a lot. But I'm looking forward to it, especially when you start getting into the 80s, which is only a generation removed from probably most of the people running the show. I mean, that's really tough because you're talking about a period that isn't that much different. You know, when you're talking about the fashion of your own, I think The Crown did it really well. The Americans did it really well of, you know, showing you a period that's different, but it still has some of those modern touches. I think that's really hard to do. That's so hard to do. Like, I would never have found myself drawn to the 80s, but watching some of these, I'm kind of like, I do miss acid wash, you know?
Mad Men is a big one for me too, because I think it did something that more people need to consider. Mad Men had a collaborations with Banana Republic and some other designers to recreate at least styles in the show, if not whole outfits. more people need to consider this when they are planning their marketing. I know Outlander has done some of that as well with Hot Topic and her universe, but like I think more people should think about this. Like Unique Vintage had it as a prank with Bridgerton. But I'm like, and they came out with like one dress that was like $400. I'm like, okay, you can't wear that in the street. It's a party dress. Like that's Regency like inspired. I'm like, come on, more people should do this. Like I still have my Mad Men Banana Republic line clothing. It also was one of the first ones where you for that era where you saw they had a costume tour and inspired by things like that was a huge part of the Mad Men marketing. People wanted to have those 60s silhouettes. Like everybody wanted to look like Betty or look like Joan, or that was like kind of a big part of the experience of watching. And also another thing with internet, that was like the first big American period drama where there's so much like internet discussion about it. Everybody had blogs, everybody had Twitter and stuff like that. Like all those live tweets were like iconic the same way that Down Abbey was, because it touched like people who did not care about period drama before were like participating in cosplay, were like all in it, like involved in like the world of it. But I'm glad for Mad Men because there were two shows that kind of were like before and after the Mad Men trend that were also from the 60s. I also like I loved like outfits from I always want to dress up as. I've never managed to do it though. The first is The Hour, which is often called British Mad Men because it's set around the same era, like late 50s, early 60s. It's about a bunch of journalists trying to dig up various scandals in the world. It was canceled, unfortunately, by BBC, but it starred Ben Whishaw and Romola Garai, and it was amazing. Like, a lot of the outfits that Romola Garai's character wore were very much similar to things that Joan would have. There was this one suit that she has in one of the promos that's like blue suit, like blue 1960s, like sleek kind of, I guess, I forgot the cut they would call it, but it was like, it's so iconic in my head. I'm like, I always wanted to like sew that, but I'm really bad at modern sewing. Like I really only get the Regency and earlier dresses out of that, but I that's sort of like one of my goals because I love that era. I'm like, I'm sure if I wore one of those dresses, people who Belle's dresses, that's her character's name. I'm like, they're gonna assume I'm like Joan. I'm like, no, I'm Belle really, because she was a woman in a workplace, which is definitely different in a lot of the Mad Men characters. But she was also a woman in a workplace where there was a lot of like not just sexism drama, but just a lot of political drama in there too, and some communism shenanigans as well, because our cast dealt really heavily with politics, so that was a huge like thing for them. But like I was also grateful for the Mad Men stuff because I was able to get like more references for costumes because it's a similar era. But like again, that's the bad thing about liking British TV, because you don't get all the like fun stuff that comes with the merchandise and marketing. So you have to kind of like live vicariously through things that are like similar. Another big one for me, even though it's not a TV show, well, it is a movie technically, Hamilton. Like that was a huge goals of costume design. Like, I mean, obviously there's so much in there with merchandising, not so much costume creation in terms of like officially, but there's so many Hamilton inspired things out there. And of course, I want to make all of Angelica Schuyler's outfits. I'm doing it one at a time, of course, because fabric's expensive. Because she's wearing all silks of various things and a lot of wool. So those like that, her outfits are just everything. They're just a great example of adapting mid-1760s fashion. So I was like, I have inspiration from the 1960s and the 1760s at the same time. That's the great thing about period drama. You can just kind of jump from one era to the other, and it's like almost a smooth transition.
I think for me, when it comes to like my goals, like when I'm like breathless, probably literally it's late Victorian. And so Crimson Peak is probably, in terms of like the oh my God factor. I mean, anytime Tom Hiddleston is dressed in period clothing, I can just like faint and be fine. But everything that is worn in the film, especially the women's gowns, the film itself was a disappointment to me because I love Guillermo del Toro and it wasn't quite what I was hoping, but that's okay. I have like two modes. I can just be in costume mode and it's fine. I just enjoyed the film for looking at the textures and the bows and the silhouettes and how they were adapting it for this sort of like uber gothic horror kind of thing that they were doing. I loved the color palettes, the use of chartreuse. Oh my God, I got so excited. You know, you're weird when you get excited about a certain shade. But I absolutely love the silhouettes in that film. And then I love Penny Dreadful and everything that Eva Green wore in that show. You know, she's just, her character was also just incredible, but she had this incredible range on the show. So from her like night shifts where she was in demon mode to her incredibly impeccable gowns, they just were able to do so much with all the characters, and that also kind of I think dovetailed nicely. I love Western fashion. Like I had a big cowboy phase and the Young Guns films were huge for me. So I love sort of 1880s, 1890s fashion and looking at how those shapes and both men and women and sort of that in the middle, because there were a lot of people that just wore clothes because that's what they had. You know, women were farmhands and men were, you know, whatever. It was the Wild West. And so there was a lot of kind of fun playing around with all different kinds of shapes and designs, and you had what you had and you adapted that on the frontier. And so yeah, I think those are for me the ones that just kind of take my breath away. And I've always loved that sort of vision of the woman and coming into the Wild West town and stepping off of the carriage and everyone looks like crap, but she is in that incredible tight-laced, you know, steel-born corset from the city with the hat and the black, and everyone is just like, who is this person? She's like a goddess of death or something. Incredibly uncomfortable. Bustles are never going to be part of my own repertoire, but I think it's an incredible thing to see on screen.
And that's an iconic thing, right? That's been used across a lot of that genre. And things that we, I'm sure, always have tried to emulate ourselves. You know, like I know as a teen, when I was like, I'm walking on a Hot Topic with my new like all black stuff. Yeah, I am making the same impression, right?
Putting the goth in gothic. I mean, we all got it from there. That
was the go-to.
Are way older, but whatever, you know. Yeah.
We talked about some of these parts, and you know, getting into the downsides of these things that need some work. What are the costume dramas, either like the dramas themselves, titles, or even tropes that you cringe at and that you're just like, we need to do better, we should have done better? We kind of talked about some Game of Thrones things, problematic AF. There are also, you know, we can get into parts around like just total erasure of people of color in a lot of these. CC, as much as I love Austin stuff, that's been a massive problem. Then also the aspects around, you know, even just costume itself, Rain versus you know, anything else. Anything.
Rain was just confusing. I can't understand why they're all running around the castle wearing Free People clothes. I mean, that's just like, I like Free People. It's a pretty brand, but I have so many questions because it's not consistent. I think that's, for me, my biggest issue with the show is like other people are wearing period costumes to the letter almost, especially the men in the show.
Yeah. But
the girls, the four girls, are dressed like they went to the mall and in kind of cottagecore. I don't know. I mean, it's very different than Bridgerton, which was like cohesive, right? Yeah. Bridgerton was like, you felt that this was like this sort of like almost Willy Wonka cupcake sugar town kind of like, yeah, they're using laser cut fabrics and plastics and stuff, but it's consistent. And it's like with the characters, like the certain families have their own aesthetics and color palettes, and that makes sense. It's consistent, that it doesn't have to be real. I'm fine with that. I totally think that's a brilliant choice in the costumer's decision, because it's kind of like alternate reality at this point, right? You're kind of in an alternate historical world. But with Rain, I have just so many questions about what is going on with the costumes. I've yet to get an answer that makes any sense other than, I don't know. I don't know. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that one?
Well, I have to confess, I've never actually seen Rain, but due to the reaction that it has had from the costuming community and the kind of the stills that I have seen from the show, I have made the decision that I cannot bring myself to watch it. So obviously take what I say with a pinch of salt, because obviously I've only seen like obviously the stills, you know, that everybody kind of rants about. But yeah, it just comes across to me that I don't like to to kind of be negative towards costume designers. I do have a lot of friends who do work in the industry and kind of know the industry, and I do appreciate that costuming has its problem areas, and the designers aren't always, they have to work to a budget, and they have to work with the director, and there's lots of different factors that can influence costume design and choices. But yeah, when it comes to a historical drama, and you clearly looks like you've put your characters in modern clothing without any kind of historical essence of anything, that just seems poor to me. And I know whether it's a budget thing or I don't know, but yeah, just to have no kind of design concept. So, and kind of coming back around to Bridgerton, and I think we could probably count perhaps the Tudors in there as well, shows that they've gone down obviously a non-historically accurate kind of route, but the design elements, and it's kind of that thing I said with Game of Thrones and that whole that level between in fantasy costuming, having those design elements. I mean, the Tudors, there's a lot of non-historically accurate kind of stuff going on in there, but it's beautifully done, and I kind of think that. And that adds to the story. I mean, I know some people probably take or leave, whether it distracts from the historical elements of the story or not. But to me, it worked for me. And again, with Bridgerton, because I went into it with open eyes, knowing it wasn't going to be pure kind of Regency, and take everything with a bit of a pinch of salt. But to know that they had gone for this kind of fantastical kind of element with their costuming. But they designed it, and they've chosen the colours and chosen the looks and the styling, and it works for me. What they did in Reign, I don't know.
I did hear one person say they thought that it would help younger audiences connect with it, like it would modernize it. But I guess back to what Bianca was saying, like if they're going to go that way, then they should have also diversified the cast. They could have done a whole bunch of things to make it more acceptable. Like if you're literally going to go and grab stuff from Belk or from Macy, put it on, you could have also extended that to diverse casting and have queer characters and have much more. But no, it was very much cast like every white Tudor show out there, with no real thought really behind any of that. So I don't know.
Yeah, and it wasn't cast like the others. I feel like kind of like teenagey kind of CW shows,
right?
Which I feel like were, at least my memory, trying to do better,
right? At least like sidekicks or somebody tangentially that was like maybe, yeah. It's questionable. I don't know.
I mean, I would have also loved to have had Reign just be really blatant and be like, costuming brought to you by the blank this week, like a banner, like literally just go one extreme for me, please, so that I know where we're going as like an audience member, and I can be like, cool, I got you. I don't have to.
You got today's makeup looks by Urban Decay. Yeah, no, I mean, it's even the hair and stuff too. It's like, and that's what I love about Bridgerton, because like the hairstyles, they are forward a little bit, because I mean, we know the 1820s and 30s, like, whoa, I mean, talk about hairstyles, and they kind of pulled from that, and I love that because they're wacky, but they are kind of historical, so they're kind of grounded in this, like they were just kind of like, let's see what we can make hair do. But with Reign, they're just wearing this like long hair, which like you do 5 minutes of research on that period, and women of marriageable age would not be wearing long hair. That just is not appropriate. So I don't know. I mean, look at any picture of anyone from that period. It's all bound up in hats, and then there's the gabled hats, and then there's the English bond. I mean, anyway.
In terms of too, I'd like to shift to like think about yes, lack of diversity, but also I think lack of context or even characterization of things. Yes, I think that like a lot of Regency stuff has been massively whitewashed in a way that like I know some even Austen scholarly spaces try to argue about, but we also know in controversially that like she does have an awareness that people of color do exist in her world, because she does write a woman of color, Miss Lamb, in Sanditon. And I think that's a really interesting space to talk through too, in terms of now adaptations are moving into this space, but there have been problematic aspects of Regency as a whole. Like the dresses are as wet as the cast.
There's a lot there. I think the conversations around historical accuracy on screen, I think one problem is that now that we're going these shows are casting diversely, they're now incorporating African and Black culture styles or other people color styles into their costuming. And now all of a sudden it's inaccurate because someone like me is on the screen now, or someone like Anna is on the screen. But it's like, wait a second. Do you know anything about Black hair, or like what a Black person would have, who's not a slave, would have worn in that era? No, you don't. So I would say it's very interesting to see how people would point out a lot of mistakes in Bridgerton, but other similar era shows, the same mistakes or worse ones were made, and nobody's talking about this. Like, for example, the 2016 War and Peace that was on Lifetime for some reason. I don't know why they picked this up, and the BBC. All everybody talks about is, oh, Lily James looks so cute. But you have Gillian Anderson in a 1930s Grecian, probably from Party City dress, and everybody else is 1805. That it's kind of Rain level. Like, so if you really start looking at their costumes, it's like Rain level mistakes, because I'm like, where did you get the 1930s from 1805? I don't know. Like, how far, like, the TARDIS didn't show up. I don't know why they leaked that far. But in Bridgerton, it's all of a sudden bad that those but Bridgerton had an aesthetic. Of course, it may not be everybody's cup of tea, but at least they mashed up some 1950s and 60s stuff with Edwardian, with the Regency. But apparently it's bad that mashup existed in Bridgerton, but they don't come after War and Peace the same way. And the only answer I can think of is because people of color involved. That's the only thing. That's the only thing they're explaining. Yeah. Like, no, like, where is the critiques of that? I feel like when you talk about historical accuracy nowadays, or like costuming on screen, you have to kind of take a step back and think about, we haven't seen in past dramas the existence of folks of color. Like, you have to think about other influences on style that costume designers are going to be pulling from. Like, for example, people were having meltdowns over Queen Charlotte's afro. I'm like, if you think about it, if you really step back a second, various Black hairstyles were not treated with electric implements like hair. Like, they didn't have hair dryers back then. They didn't have chemical straightening back then. So if you think about it, natural hairstyling is actually more historically accurate. And braiding and locks and all that stuff is more historically accurate because they didn't use heat and they didn't use chemicals. So, but somehow it's inaccurate, that it's historically incorrect that Queen Charlotte is afro. Like, that's kind of ridiculous to think about it. If you unpack what people are saying about these things, I think the costume community in the future dramas, because we all know a couple years from now we're gonna have at least 6 Bridgerton ripoffs, or people trying to apply the Bridgerton concepts to other eras. Like, I don't doubt this, because again, there's a bunch of, romance novels and other things out there that people wrote, and now networks and studios will be trying to look for the next big thing. This will be trying to continue. We have to kind of think as a community of costume enthusiasts, like, if you have a drama that's speaking to these issues, how is that going to play out in the costuming, and how are we going to interpret that? As you said before, Bridget with Sanditon has Miss Lamb as a central character, but she has this very vague history of being from the Caribbean, but they didn't really address it. Her costumes, she oddly enough had the most money in the town, but they treated her half the time like she was a servant, which is kind of awkward. But she had the most money. She was wearing she's wearing the highest of silk quality, everything. She was wearing all her outfits were insanely expensive. But then some of the other characters the town were wealthy as well. But the show's plot line really didn't address some of those issues in a coherent way. And then they had, of course, another thing that people like to talk about a lot is they like to criticize modern hair seeping into period hair, like where the long wavy hair, or women who are of magical age with no bonnets or no the great hairpin shortage supposedly. And I feel like sometimes people who are costume enthusiasts have to remember that certain choices are not because they are making purposeful mistakes. They're trying to indicate something about a character that you may not know about when you just look at that still shot. Like in Sanditon, the main character was naive and she was younger. She didn't really know what was going on. Charlotte was making snap judgments about people. And they kind of communicated that through her hair, among other things. Bridgerton, the same thing happened. Like a lot of people were like yelling at the Featherington outfits, those loud, like, why is she wearing lime green? In the books, it said that they were wearing out garish costumes. That's what we see on screen. Like, not every influence is because they didn't want to open up a history book. You got to think about characters and communicating facts. You can't just spend 2 minutes in monologue doing. Like, that's where you have to think about how costuming tells a story, not just the story of the period. And also, once you have diverse voices in a story, it's going to change the way your styling is going to happen. Because there's certain hairstyles or certain, like, the people wouldn't wear those. Like, even in that era, or even today, it just wouldn't look good. Like that all white palette, like, it's just not what culturally would have happened. I mean, what is sometimes, because in some cases, yeah, but other times, like, are you sure about that? Like, it's like, you really want everybody wearing beige? Like, you sure about that? Like, when people, especially when you talk about like characters like Marina, like, you really want her, like, she was wearing neutral tones, but she always had some kind of embroidery on it. It's like, it looked a little bit, it looked fancier than usual. Like, because some people's complaints are like, oh, are you really sure about that? Like, you really sure about that aesthetic that's kind of dated and based on one piece in a museum that we couldn't preserve? Because again, a lot of the costume history we don't know about is because it was not preserved.
Yeah.
Wasn't written down. The elites didn't record what poor people were wearing a lot. So in those costumes, those dress clothes were used until they couldn't be used anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The survivor bias. Yeah.
Yeah, they were reshaped. They were made, like, they were worn down. People talk all the time about, like, sometimes you will see like old garment pieces were used, like, they're cushions now. Like, that's just the reality of those things. And
that's why we have so many wedding dresses. There's so many wedding dresses that exist once white became the thing, especially because you couldn't wear that again. Like,
along the lines too of how people perceive and receive, I think it's been really interesting too, because Emma 2020 actually, yes, they have a bunch of white dresses, but they did try to deviate from the just all whites. Like, they did introduce color palettes that we hadn't really seen a ton of, that are actually not that far off from the color palettes we do see in Bridgerton. We see those things and the nods to the 1830s hair. So it's very interesting to see these very distinct perceptions. And I'm like, I don't know, I think there's a there is, so y'all aren't happy with people of color existing. But I also think too, to your point, Amanda, I think that, like, it's having people of color in the room on all levels. It's not just in front of the camera. I think that, like, the lessons we are learning, either in the industry or wherever you are on those pathways, those structural pathways, is you need to have writers in the room. You need to have them in the, in your makeup discussions, in your hairdressing, in all of the places, because that is how you actually make that feel cohesive and real, and you don't just plop some poor actor into a role that they now have to do a lot of helping with, or they're just in this uncomfortable space that doesn't benefit anybody, them, or whatever statement you think you're trying to make, because you actually take away some agency from an actor if you make them have to do all the research for you, and I think that, like, it's one of those things where it's like, best efforts going forward would be having the actual people in the room in all those layers so they can make that work.
Can we talk about harlots for a second? Because I feel like that's one period drama that gets overlooked. And I know it wasn't a super popular show, but I feel like it kind of had like a small but, dedicated following. And I think kind of like with what Amanda was saying, it managed to have a very multicultural cast. in a way that I feel like will best shut up all the people who are saying, oh, but it's not accurate, it's not accurate. They gave every single character an accurate storyline, a very accurate storyline of, talking about why they were in London at the time, what they were doing, who they were interacting with. I think they did a fantastic job, and also did a great job of something that we don't see a lot is working class characters. We don't see a lot of that in period dramas. It tends to be about the aristocracy, or maybe, one plucky character that makes their way to the top. We don't see what were poor people doing besides living in squalor? What were their concerns? What were their clothes like? What were they making an effort to wear versus not wear? And not that Harlots is incredibly, it's not the most accurate, but I think it's one that sort of tackles the idea of inclusion in a way that's not pandering, that's not just adding one character, and also that makes sense for the period. You have a lot of characters coming in because of, being seamen or escaped slaves from America. You have all these different characters of color coming in for all these different reasons that makes sense for the time, that makes sense with regard to the plot. I think, okay, with the title being Harlots, I think if you haven't seen it, you kind of can guess what it's about. The subject matter is a little bit graphic, true, but if we've all seen Game of Thrones, it's nothing you can't handle. And I think it just gets repeatedly overlooked for some reason. I don't know if maybe because it's a show about women, or I don't know what it is, but I think it's a wonderful example as to how you could handle it, how you can do it. I think with a way that is a lot less beating you over the head with, look, we're going to be diverse. Like, you don't have to do that. It's okay. But I think they did it in a way that was very organic. I think also the costumes were really well thought out. In the way that they showed, okay, what would someone who is not a sex worker be wearing to try to differentiate herself? What would some of the clients look like? How are they dressing? How is someone who, all these different things. I think they did such a good job, and it's so frequently left out of conversations, I feel like.
I have some theories, talking to journalist side of myself. First of all, in the UK, it was aired on a now discontinued streaming service, because like ITV, because you have the BBC that's like public television, ITV's commercial. They had like a discontinued like premium streaming service at one point that's now like reformatted, kind of folded in partially into BritBox. Mm-hmm. But that was the one problem. And then it re-aired on BBC Two, which is sort of a sub-channel. That's one problem, like exposure. In US, Hulu is a paid service. It was pre the Disney Plus takeover. All the episodes aired before that. So again, not many people had Hulu, especially paid Hulu, before Disney Plus had those bundle deals. Secondly, the subject matter was definitely for the folks who want those PG period dramas, and when half of your characters are sex workers, that's going to be, for some people, a serious, like, quote unquote, moral problem. It's not fluffy. You're dealing with crime in real life and issues that are like in the justice system and and slavery and colonialism, all that stuff that they don't like discussing. So in certain period drama groups, they're not, and also the other issue too, once you have sex workers, you also have queer characters, and a lot of people have issues with blatant homophobia. So that's sort of the subject matter already between the advertising and reach of the audience, and you have the subject matter, the initial stuff, even before you get to the characters of color, because again, in the promos was mostly the main characters in the promos were white characters. They weren't even noticing the characters of color in half the promos. But yeah, it was sort of that subject area where they're just like, I'm not gonna touch this. They're like, I'm not even gonna deal with it. It's because a lot of times too, in especially on Facebook, the like period drama discussion groups, like if you started talking about harlots, like soon enough you get banned because you have to start clapping back at some, bigot or like pearl, like it's not like Hallmark, it was, that kind of thing. So yeah, that's kind of the main reasons why it gets overlooked. I also think too, it's also in its own transitional period, because it's a transition between, I want to say, the sort of French inspired 18th century stuff and the more quote unquote English styling. There's a lot of, it's in its own transition, and it's also it's not an era that people really talk about on screen. It's even pre-American Revolution too. Mm-hmm. So that's another thing. It doesn't really have a hook of that people can kind of relate to. Because sometimes that's also why a lot of period dramas get popular, is that there's a hook of things you learned in school or eras you keep seeing on screen. Like people know about, or books that you will recognize as taking place in that era. Harlots doesn't, because Harlots is a different view of the 1760s and 1770s, that it's not the royal family, it's not the wars. So there's also that whole just social history too is another factor as to why. But I love Harlots as an example of how you can do things right and still teach people about history. Because at the end of the day, people are probably going to encounter history more through stage and screen versus somebody's book in a library. Mm-hmm. That's just what it is.
Yeah.
Same thing with costume history too. You're counter.
Yeah. And using like that to transition to, because these are really related topics, into what do you want to see from the future of costume dramas and what do we hope to see? And I think that is a really good. I mean, we've kind of talked about a lot of the things, but I think too, like the basics of just not only diverse casting and like having more than white people on screen. It is what we talked about, like some of the things about Harlots that people were uncomfortable with, which was having queer representation. I think that show also had like more body diversity than I've seen in a few things, that especially corseted dramas, to my memory at least. I think, having more actors with disabilities, like all of these things are things that are just like glaringly almost reinforcing the like history books, that just have the portraits of the upper echelons. And I think that is a space where this genre could really grow. And, there was that obsession with the, upstairs, downstairs, Downton Abbey, because it was like, oh, we finally get to see poor people and like that interaction. It's like, instead of like glamorizing that, why don't we dig deeper? Because clearly there's an itch that someone wants to scratch, that audiences want to see about the realities. And much like other, I think, things that we mentioned, called The Midwife, even parts of Mad Men, like there are parts of those that really delve into like, they aren't the richest of the rich, they're real people. And I think there's something to be said for, when we're taking that on, having real people and not just this little circle of who real people are. But yeah, my rant, what would you like to see in the future of this genre? And, what are you excited about?
I think exactly that. I think we want to see more historical accuracy, not in the weird bigoted sense, but in the sense of, if you're looking into the history of it, like Amanda said, like most people are getting it from TV. It's, all of us nerds in the corners who are reading the books and the primary sources and all those things. And I think the fascination is we want to see it on screen. I think it brings it to life in a way that, just reading about it or looking at portraits doesn't quite grasp. And I think we want to see all these different people portrayed, all these different walks of life portrayed. I think we want to see more of that. And also, even in portrayals that aren't going for accuracy, I think I want to see more of the Tudors. Really, it was not accurate in terms of costuming, but it was consistent. And the same thing with Game of Thrones. Like, it's a fictional land. Westeros doesn't exist, but it was consistent. It made it all feel like it was real and came together, and it got the tone right. So it's not about were they wearing corsets or not, or any of that. It made sense for those characters, and it also made sense for the time. I think we all want to see more of that. I think in including so many people that haven't been included overall, like no matter what, I want to see so much more working class period dramas. I can't take it. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love the aristocracy. Like obviously I was obsessed with The Crown along with everyone else in quarantine, but there's something about seeing people that are probably closer to you than you know, people with these insane amounts of money. And you know, it's fun because they can do things, you know, that we all can't. But after a while, I really, I don't know, I find myself wanting to know, okay, but what about people that don't have buckets of money, who just spend their days, you know, just Marie Antoinette hardcore, like, what do I do today? I've done everything. I want to know, what were they doing? I think Anne with an E, if anyone's seen that, based off of Anne of Green Gables. And I think that one does a great job of showing what were regular people doing, what were their concerns, you know, all these things like that. That's what I want to see. I just want to see more inclusion on all levels. And I also want to see more care put into costuming as a vehicle for moving forward the story. It's not an afterthought. It's very much a part of what makes it a costume drama at all. Don't have one if you're not going to put some thought into the outfits, whether they're accurate or not, whether that's the vibe you're going for or not. I just want to see more attention paid to it, because there's so many that are kind of lazy about it. Not even just bad, like Rain bad. That's been talked to death, but just the ones where you can tell they just kind of put the actor in something, and you can tell when it might be a budget decision or a director decision, and when it's just, hey, we need a shirt, let's do something. And I don't know, I just want to see it sort of given its due as a genre, like all the other ones.
Yeah, appreciation for costume design, you know, as a skill set. I think it's something that is very much, or has certainly been very much undervalued. And even kind of from my perspective as a kind of a professional dressmaker working with clients, getting people to understand the costs involved in actual costuming. And again, seeing kind of in some of the costuming groups on Facebook and other sort of social media, you know, and you hear these stories about how the costume departments are treated, and it seems like they're treated second rate. And you know, if you're going to do that, then that's going to reflect, you know, on screen. You know, good costuming isn't cheap, and it's really not easy, you know. So you need to kind of make sure you're paying and appreciating your costuming staff, and you will see that return. And we see that in productions where they have used that budget. So like I say, coming back to Game of Thrones and the level of detail that you go to in there, these high-end productions are really starting to show up and show that difference between, you know, when low budget isn't going to cut it, you know, especially if you're going to do historical or fantasy, you've got to put that effort in, and you've got to, I want to see more of that, and I'm hoping that, like I say, these high-end productions that we're seeing now are going to help to start influence that kind of decision making.
Yeah, for me, a couple of things. Like, for a lot of times, in certain little thing, costuming that are corset based, I want to see the period productions kind of lean in a little bit more to the folks who know how to do that design. Not so much for accuracy's sake, but sort of things like what some actresses are often not wearing chemises, which is actually not, it's not so much being an accuracy issue, it's a safety issue, because that could cause shaping. Because bras, the chemises back then were not built like modern bras, like the corsets and stays. They were not built like that. So it's a little bit of a safety issue when you have the actors just wearing the corsetry without the chemises. I'm like, that's something that the costume community has pointed out a lot of times in different dramas, like that whole tight lacing trope, which isn't always accurate to certain eras. It's a huge thing I think they need to think about. With diverse productions, again, definitely not just having one Black actor. You gotta have to think about your whole production, also think about how that person can be styled, think about the differences in connotation when you're putting on certain costumes. It's thinking about all those things, not just one step being enough. I also, when Ayana brought up Anthony, something I'd like to see as well is more YA and teen productions thinking about themselves as costume dramas. I mean, we've seen now Anthony is very successful. We've seen Enola Holmes, you know, it's got a little bit of a mixture fantasy with that. Like they had their own like kind of pseudo Victorian thing. I also noticed, even though it's not being talked about at all, it's not quite period. They have a period aesthetic with a completely sort of fantasy adventure story on Disney Plus. The Mysterious Benedict Society. It's all 60s retro for kids. So in a weird way, it's like Mad Men styling for kiddies. Have like embrace the costume for that demo, because we kind of need the baby period drama addicts to start somewhere simple before they can graduate to Austin. So more, because also I think YA and teen productions can address issues and of course address kids who are not princesses and talk about the various things in history. Like there's a lot of stuff Anna you talked about in history, not just about diversity, but just things that like other productions have never touched in 1,000 years because they're dealing with kids. I'm like, why? I want to see. I'm like, the BBC. You guys have done so many adult productions and ITV. Like, why don't you do one that's all for children, and not just claim it's for teenagers and then only 50-year-olds watching it? I'm talking to you, Victoria. BBC, ITV Victoria. Like, yeah, you had a teenager story where only 50-year-olds are watching it. It's a little awkward. It's just a pitch. Like, more YA things and more diverse things.
I want to say, if I could just add in, when obviously being from the UK, when I was a kid, Sunday evenings, there was nearly always some kind of like costume kind of based drama on around kind of tea time. You know, I mean, I can remember we had The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when I was very, very young. I can vaguely remember bits of that. I think we had The Children of the New Forest was one that was done as well. And it varies, like these kind of, sort of Sunday afternoon, sort of late Sunday sort of tea time kind of family costume dramas, which for me, you know, that has helped instill in me a kind of that interest in history and costume. And I'm trying to think, you know, kind of in very recent years, there's not been as many, I don't think.
No, half the time it's just Doctor Who.
Yeah, well, I mean, Doctor Who became the kind of the go-to for them, really, didn't it, for a long, long time? I mean, obviously, it became so popular kind of in the Tennant era that I think the BBC probably just plugged all of their efforts into that. But yeah, I think there was, because I know Hetty Feather, which might be on Hulu somewhere. I mean, I think that was a kind of for kids period drama, but again, for every one of those, there are like 50,000 ones just for adults or just family viewing, because again, can't show harlots to a 5-year-old. So like there's a lot of things nowadays. They're pushing the upper limits of the rating system just because Netflix will not censor you for saying the F word, but then they're kind of forgetting the other end of the spectrum too. It's like, well, you kind of have to have some things that are like family viewing.
Where's the American Girl adaptations now? Like somebody.
Exactly. There's things right there. There's things right there that they're not thinking about. Because like in 90s, even like we had Liberty's Kids in Hysteria. Like, come on.
I think Dear America tried a couple, I think.
There's a couple like one-off movies.
Yeah.
They're not,
that's why I'm like, let's revisit. Let's do better.
Yeah.
I think for me, I'm with Ayana. I really want to see more about the people who are making the clothing, who are keeping the clothing, who are creating the fabrics. I think we tend to very easily brush that away. I see it in my own, you know, as a writer, I see a lot of world building that just kind of brushes it and just says, oh, they're wearing silk. I'm like, okay, where did they get the silkworms from? Where are they growing mulberry trees? Is it the right kind of mulberry tree? How long have they been building it? How do they have the infrastructure to keep that going? Or is it a different kind of silk? I mean, you can make it up. Like you can make silk out of clams. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. There's spider silk. I mean, you can do it, but like think about it and think about the systems around that. You know, we talked a lot about whiteness, literal whiteness in Regency and muslin. Obviously, that's a big hot topic, and literally built on the backs of oppressed people in Bangladesh, and it's turned into this sign of purity and status. And oh, Mr. Tillany talking about how he knows about muslin, but no, he's not also saying like, oh, these people are basically living in an enslaved state, having to do this, and we've erased their culture and entire way of living and how they can actually create, like, grow their own food. And then we kind of booked out of there, so they had nothing left, you know, and starved to death, like millions and millions of people. It's like you don't have to dig very far to see how bad that is. And I feel like, you know, it's just so easy for people to gloss over it. And it's getting to the point where I just get really, really frustrated because it's lazy and it's broken. It's really broken. And fabric culture still is a mess. It's incredibly toxic to the environment. It's oppressive to people. There's still child labor happening all over the world. You know, it's still a problem. Yes, we're thankfully making handmade things. We love wearing vintage. We love doing these things. We try to do our best, but it's also become so wound into the world that we are. So I think that it's important for us to push creators, and, you know, because books turn into movies and movies turn into our fandoms, and there's always this connection. And history has always been full of the people, you know, the women going blind, making lace at, you know, a meter a year. You're really talking about your 30 meters of lace for your year, and then you might die. You might go blind and you can't make this thing again. And someone is covering one outfit for one person. That's your life's work. I mean, it's horrific what that thing can kind of turn us into. It's a kind of monstrous beauty, which is one of the things I think is so compelling about the story. And I think that's what is so, you know, horrific about it. It is this incredibly gorgeous thing of ball gowns and Cinderella. You know, I mean, that moment of Cinderella in Disney, like you were talking about earlier, twirling. And I mean, all of us wanted that moment, but where did that come from? You know, Merlin in The Once and Future King talks about magic has to come from somewhere. I can't just make a loaf of bread from nothing. Someone is missing a loaf of bread somewhere. And fashion is kind of like that too. You know, it comes from something. It is not beauty for the sake of beauty. And now we're at a point where high fashion physically is not that different from low fashion. It's about this, it's about how much you paid for it. It's about the signature on it, you know, and that's a whole other ballgame and a whole other conversation. But I think it is getting better. I just saw Sir Gawain and the Green Knight last night, which made me very excited because I saw King Arthur, Legend of the Sword, a couple of years ago, and he wears a t-shirt at one point, and I can't, my brain just so confused. But the costuming is phenomenal. I'm going to do a quick thread talk on Monday just to talk about it. The use of color, they really thought about things. Some short, I mean, you know, there's going to, like Amanda was talking about earlier, Amanda-Rae, sorry. There is going to be shorthand in film. There's going to be places where we're not going to get the full story. But if it is consistent and it is pulling something through, then there is a lot of value in that. It is, especially in film, right? You don't have time necessarily to like build it through. But I'm going to go on, especially about the velvet cloak that he wears throughout most of the film, and the kind of battering that goes through, and the symbolic nature of that, and the color, and like they really thought about that, and the crepe taffeta that the women are wearing, and this like the crowns that are created. I mean, this doesn't look like anything that's been made before, but it's all tied to medieval iconography and illuminated manuscripts, and clearly they did their work, which is like, they haven't done that for so long. It's like we have all of it here, but you just ignored it. Okay, 1,000 years of stuff, but sure, whatever. You like the idea of a dude pulling a sword from a stone, and that's just all we're gonna get from you, I guess. So I think it is getting better. We still have a lot of ways to go in representation, and I always tell people that presence is not representation. And I think, you know, I am a white person. I don't have that issue, but I have the queerness issue, and that's something that bothers me for a long time. Is that, oh, but there was a queer person in that show. Okay, were any of the writers queer? Did anyone, you know, queer fashion is its own thing. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the blog dressingdykes.com, but it's a phenomenal resource about mostly 20th century and late 19th century queer fashion and trends that have changed the world from primarily lesbian fashion onward, and just phenomenal stuff. And I feel like we're getting momentum in that department, but also giving credit where it's due to African-American fashion, to fashion that came from Asia, from Japan, because most of it did not come from white people. Like, Generally speaking, almost everything, every time I do a thread talk, 95% of the time, it was something that was taken from somebody else. Very, very rarely do I find a fabric or a style of dress or a method of anything that was not taken by Western culture. And we need to be aware of that. And I think in media, we need to start thinking about what that means for our care. I think Sanditon is starting, like you're saying, it's like starting to kind of go down that route, but we have a long way to go. We really do.
Thank you all for being with us today. Thank you all for being on this panel. There's so much that I would just love to deep dive into. Maybe we will one day. But for now, where can people find you to follow your work, to support what you do on the interwebs?
You can find me anywhere on the internet, anywhere on social media. If I have it, I will be called the Vintage Guidebook in some iteration, character limits, all that withstanding. But if you search that, you will find me.
On Twitter, I am at Amanda-Rae Prescott. And on Instagram, which I don't really use often, but you see my old costume things, and occasionally I pop up with new costume things, it's at Amanda Poldar.
Okay, you can find me as Blue Lady Couture on YouTube. I'm at Joe Blue Lady Couture on Instagram. You'll also find me on Facebook, Pinterest, and on Etsy as well.
And I make it pretty simple. I am at Natanya Barron just about everywhere except for TikTok, where I am at Natanya Books.
Thank you all so much.